Now that more people are in, I want to start. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Unstoppable Together. Today, we are honored to have you for Steadfast and Rising, Disability Justice in Asian and Pacific Islander Communities. My name is Malik Gooch, and I'm with the Colorado Cross Disability Coalition, or CCDC for short, but hopefully, if you are a repeat attender, you would know that. Uh, but for anyone new, CCDC is Colorado's largest and oldest disability led organization committed to ensuring that people with all types of disabilities have equal rights and opportunities. Our work is rooted in advocacy, leadership, and community power, centering disabled voices in every space where decisions are made. As mentioned before, today's event is part of our Unstoppable Together campaign, an initiative dedicated to celebrating the power and leadership of people of color and those living at the intersections thriving with disabilities. Unstoppable Together brings us conversations, storytelling, community, and actions that move us closer to true disability justice. As we hear from our incredible panelists today, we invite you to listen with open hearts, reflect on the complexity of our communities, and think about how we can rise together, steadfast and strong. But a few notes before we dive in. We do have ASL interpretation, live captioning, and unfortunately for this event, we do not have Spanish translation available. So we'll make notes of that. We'll have time for audience questions towards the end, and we will let you know when to drop your questions in the chat later tonight. And with that, let's begin. Please join me in welcoming our amazing panelists. If you all would not mind introducing yourself, your pronouns, your titles, and how you are involved with the API community. Do you mind starting, Marha? The speaking order is
Hi, yeah, I can go. My name is
sorry,
Marja. Yeah, good
Marha.
afternoon. My name is Marja Possner. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. My role is community empowerment advocate, and I work with deaf overcoming violence through empowerment. My role in relationship to the Asian Pacific Islander community is very, how do you say it? I don't feel very really I don't feel a deep sense of attachment in the API community because I grew up in a predominantly white community. I was adopted from South Korea at a young age and moved to America when I was only 5 months old. And so that's all that I've ever known, was just that white community, a white culture. And so it wasn't until later in my life when I really learned more about the Asian Pacific Islander community and culture. And I'm really excited to be here and share more with you all. Thank you.
Okay, next, Sarita, and please correct me on your names. I don't want to be disrespectful.
Hi, I'm Sarita Parikh, and I am board treasurer for CCDC. I am also a physical therapist. I have a private practice. I'm Indian, and my parents were immigrants, so I grew up in an Indian immigrant community. And so I've had this interesting, like, being first generation in the United States, where you don't truly belong in either world, and trying to navigate that world and navigate a world of disability as well.
Okay, and next, Melissa, please.
Hi, everyone. My name is Melissa Akie Wiley, pronoun she, her. I am the deputy town manager for Erie, Colorado, and I also own an LLC called Forget the Fairy Tale. And in that organization, I primarily talk to schools and organizations about disfigurement and physical disability and how it's perceived by people and how it's been dealt with in the history of law and policy, entertainment, and how it shapes our brain development from childhood into adulthood and the way that we see beauty in the world and in each other. In terms of my connections to this community, my grandma is Japanese, and she immigrated here when she was in her 30s, and she married an American soldier after World War II. I was primarily raised by my mother and grandmother, so I feel really connected to that culture through my mother and grandmother. But since my grandmother has passed, it's hard to feel such a close connection to someone who's from Japan and is a part of my day-to-day life. But I still really feel connected to who she was and who she raised me to be. And I would say, you know, being biracial and not looking particularly Japanese is a challenging thing to navigate. In this space, I think my disability has more so shaped my life and how people perceive me than my Asian Japanese identity, which most people wouldn't really know unless I said something. But definitely my disability is really visible, and so it's had a big impact on my life.
Thank you all. And we'll use that as a speaking order. But first, Hilda, our Spanish interpreter, will be providing some instructions.
Yes, good evening to everybody. This is Hilda Huillon, Spanish interpreter. And tonight we will be providing simultaneous Spanish interpretation. But for English speakers, I might become useful because when somebody's asking a question in Spanish or somebody's making a comment in Spanish, you can also use my services into English. So to do that in a few minutes, when I'm assigned as an interpreter, you will see the icon of a globe. If you are in your computer, in the lower right-hand side of your computer, you're going to see the globe. Please click in there and choose English as your language of preference. You still are going to hear everybody talking in English, but again, if somebody asks a question or makes a comment in Spanish, then you will hear my voice into English. If you are in your phone, the Spanish interpretation services will be in the upper right-hand side of your phone. 3 dots, please click in there, choose interpretation, and then choose English as your language of preference. Para todas las personas que hablen español, estamos ofreciendo esta tarde interpretación simultánea. En unos minutos, cuando sea yo asignada como intérprete, van a ver el globo terrestre que va a estar localizado en la parte inferior derecha de su pantalla. Por favor, hágase un clic ahí y después elija español como idioma de preferencia. Si usted está en su teléfono, son 3 puntitos que están en la parte superior derecha de la pantalla del teléfono. Haga un clic ahí y elija español como idioma de preferencia. Y si por favor me deja saber por el chat que usted me está escuchando para proseguir con la interpretación. Thank you, thank you. I'm ready to go.
Thank you. And with that, we can start asking our first question of the night. And I want to ask, what does disability justice mean to you personally? And how has that meaning evolved within your cultural or familial context? And can we please start with Marja?
Yeah, disability justice really means to me just inclusive practices and also accessible environments for people who have disabilities, especially for people who are deaf. For example, as a deaf person, communication access is essential, right, in every aspect of my life, whether that be appointments, meetings, community events. All of those things are really examples of inclusive practices if you provide an ASL interpreter for those, those spaces. Or also CART, captioning in real time for the folks who prefer that captioning, whether that be via a Zoom meeting or a doctor's appointment, using CART or ASL interpreters to make that space accessible. And growing up, I was the only deaf person in my family. And also in my K through 12 schooling, I was the only deaf individual in that space. Often felt left out and isolated due to that. I didn't have a lot of access to communication with my family or my school peers, just because a lot of my family members don't know sign language and did not learn sign language. My mom and my 3 brothers, they do know some rudimentary signs. My dad also, he can fingerspell using the manual alphabet. That's the extent of his language. Students and other kids that I went to school with, they typically weren't really aware of sign language. We would have to write back and forth to correspond, or I'd have to use the ASL interpreter to, just chat with my peers. Also, I was involved in sports growing up, and I always had to have an ASL interpreter in those spaces. And that was just very accessible for me growing up, and I'm appreciative of that. And that, that sort of became my chosen family. Interpreters became part of, part of my community because I interacted with them so heavily during my K through 12 years. And everything that I know and have learned, especially when it comes to communication access in the world, is, through interpreters. If not, I would not be able to be successfully competing in sports growing up or in employment opportunities now as an adult. And I work currently for a deaf organization, so communication access is not a big deal. It's not a barrier to me as opposed to my former employer where I was working in a predominantly hearing environment. And so I always had to rely on the use of an interpreter. So right now, working in a deaf organization, having direct access to that communication makes things really seamless and just less cumbersome on me. In my introduction, I did mention that I was adopted at 5 years old from South Korea. And I think if I would have stayed in Korea, I would not have the same education. I would have not had the same access to employment or communication access as I do here in America, in the United States. I often think about staying in Korea, what that would have been like, because this disability community is very looked down upon in Korea. Deaf people typically don't have the equal employment access. They don't have equal education opportunities. And they don't even have, that equal communication access for community events or anything of that nature. And so sometimes, even just making a phone call is a difficulty for, people in South America. And so I often think in the US, I'm very grateful for the communication that we have. And I am, grateful for disability justice and to see that continue.
Thank you for that. Sarita?
I forgot to mention in my intro, I have had a very recent traumatic brain injury. So I had to, I wrote down the questions. Thank you for sending them in advance. So I'm just going to read what I wrote because I don't right now have the ability to just answer the questions without having it already pre-written. So to me, disability justice means centering the wisdom, leadership, and lived experiences of disabled people, and especially honoring the intersectionality with all marginalized communities as we collectively not only work to dismantle the systems that create oppression, inequities, and exclusion, but also work towards creating a society where justice and inclusion is the norm, where we are all valued and supported for exactly who we are, for our individual and collective humanity, so we can all thrive. As someone living with epilepsy and now a recent traumatic brain injury, and raised the daughter of Indian immigrants, I've had to navigate cultural silence around disability, internalized ableism, and systemic barriers. There is stigma, fear, and a lot of pressure to push through, to perform, to never ask for help, and to never speak of my needs. Rest, accommodation, or acknowledgement was never part of my narrative. I've experienced the financial, emotional, and systemic toll of being disabled in not only a community that doesn't accept disability, but in a society that doesn't accommodate for differences, especially in a woman of color, a daughter of immigrants, and someone expected to conform to cultural ideals of strength, success, self-sufficiency, and silence around disability and limitations. It is something I continue to struggle with daily as I work to unlearn these internalized beliefs and find strength in community, interdependence, and the ability to ask for help, which with a new TBI, I am learning that I haven't really made much progress in. Added to all that, having disabilities that are invisible until they are visible is also an added challenge. To me, the importance of centering the disability community is also the importance of empowering the strength of representation for individuals to feel safe, to feel empowered, and to learn that my needs are not a burden and interdependence is a strength. Disability justice is rooted in community care, mutual aid, and fighting for a world where access is the starting point, not the end goal. It also means honoring rest, joy, our differences, our humanity, and our individuality within our broader community. As a physical therapist, I have the unique privilege of having a multidimensional perspective that shapes my healthcare practice, guides all I do as a healthcare provider, nonprofit leader, policy advocate, and entrepreneur, building systems and communities shaped and led by people with disabilities and marginalized communities. That's all I got.
Thank you for that. Next is Melissa.
Rita, that was really beautiful, and I'll have to see what I can do to follow it up, but that was really a gorgeous statement. So thank you for that. Very relatable in a lot of ways. So I'll focus on disability justice. I'll say I've been disfigured since I was 5. It was a dog attack, and I also don't have my right ear. I've been through a lot of medical treatment, so I've had close to 40 reconstructive surgeries over the course of my life. And so to me, disability justice is something I really came to later in life. As I was growing up, I didn't think I had a disability. I didn't identify with the disability community. I just thought I was a really unfortunate person. I had a really unfortunate thing happen to me. And so it took me a long time to figure out who I was and what it meant in the larger world. And so to the space of disability justice, for me, disability justice is not feeling like you have to fix yourself, which is how I felt so much of my life, that I needed to fix myself medically. My family needed to devote everything they had. We needed to put everything into making sure I had a normal face so that I would have a chance at a normal life. So I really grew up with this, I just need to fix myself. I just need to look like everybody else. And I had an experience when I was in my early 20s where my plastic surgeon let me know that there were certain things about my face that could never be fixed. For example, the nerve damage in my smile meant that my smile could never be fixed. A human ear is actually impossible to reconstruct, and so I could not have an ear. And so I had to sort of center in this space of, what if I've worked my whole life for a normal face? What if my family has sacrificed? And I use the word normal, not because I think that, but that's because how I felt as a child. And so also talk about that evolution. But I just thought, I've worked my whole life, had all these medical treatments. My family has sacrificed everything, and I will never be good enough. And of course, you know, when you have facial disfigurement, triggers a big response from the society. And part of the reason facial disfigurement is listed as part of the ADA is because of the extreme reaction of society to people with facial difference. And so I just felt like my chances for a normal life were not possible because I couldn't fix myself. So this is a long way of saying that for me, disability justice is that we don't have an expectation that people all look a certain way, that they all can do certain things, that for however people look and whatever their capabilities are or are not, they're accepted as they are. And I know many of us have gone through a lot of medical treatment, and that's a hard thing to reconcile in the brain, especially as a child, of like what things you put medical treatment towards and when to stop and when to have a level of self-acceptance. And so I've been through that whole journey of a lot of medical treatment and the surrender of the limitations of that treatment and trying to accept myself as is and asking the world to accept me as is too. So disability justice means that I don't get any more comments that are like, have you thought about fixing your face? So that's sort of, I focus more on that one, on my particular situation around facial disfigurement. I'm going to also shift to the cultural aspect, particularly of being Japanese. And I related to a lot of the comments of other panelists, but in Japanese culture, beauty is really important. Female beauty is really important. And I think we would all say the same thing about our American culture. And so I try to speak really honestly. I think that I often tell people I'm an expert on beauty, because in order to be an expert on something, you have to live at its very opposite. And I've lived at the very opposite of what it means to be a woman who's not considered physically attractive to the society. And in Japanese culture, as well as American culture, but I would say more so in Japanese culture, women's value is very much centered on her physical appearance and her beauty. And so as a child, I felt like, particularly in my Japanese side of the family, I brought shame to them. I was a shame to my family because I I was disfigured, and that to me felt like a shame-based thing to my family, and maybe that my family, there's also a religious component to a lot of disability, but that maybe what happened to me meant my family had done something wrong, or we were spiritually misaligned, and many cultures have this component as well. What does disability in a child mean for the family? But I just felt a lot of shame growing up that I wasn't a beauty, and that was a high priority in Japanese culture as an American culture. And so I would sort of add that component to particularly Asian culture and the value put on women to be physically attractive and what that means for their family and their family standing.
Okay, thank you. The next question is, what forms of ableism or stigma have you witnessed in the mainstream disability movement towards API folks? And have you encountered this within API spaces as well? How do you navigate those challenges? Can we start with Marja?
So I've had several experiences with my own deaf community as well. In my 20s, I grew up in a white community.
I was immersed in a white
until
community until I was about 18 years old. And at that time, I actually moved to New York. And in New York, there is a very strong Asian community, especially a deaf Asian community in that time. And so I was immersed in that space. Looking at that, sometimes people would look at me and say, you're not Asian enough or you're not deaf enough. And so I had this real sense of just not belonging to either community, the deaf community or the Asian community, because at that time I didn't really realize that there are some, cultural differences, and there are some cultural contexts that I should have been more respectful of and more mindful of when I was, with my deaf and Asian friends in New York City, just because they were born into, Asian families and raised with those cultural sensitivities. Although my background was so starkly different that I really did struggle with that for a while. I struggled with that until I started to learn. I started to be more, asked my Asian friends question. I said, okay, what am I doing wrong? Where can I improve? How can I become more, quote unquote, more of an ally to the deaf and Asian communities? And so I think over time I was able to learn those things and become more comfortable with it. But to this day, I still feel as though I don't 100% belong to the deaf and Asian community. And just because, here in Denver, Colorado, we just don't have many folks who also identify or that are Asian and deaf in this, in the Denver metro area. And especially, the number of deaf and Asian Americans in Denver is very, very small. And so at Dove, we actually just hired another deaf Asian co-worker here. So that feels just like a sense of, I don't know, I'm refining my identity as a Asian deaf person here living in Denver, Colorado. And I do have several friends who are deaf and who are Asian, and they do share the same struggles as I do, just because they grew up, they have the same experience as they were adopted by a white American family. And so just having those similarities and those shared experiences here in Denver is a lot different than my friends in New York City. They really had a strong cultural upbringing that was very, influenced by their Asian upbringing. And so I think when I became older, I think like around a high school age, early college age, that's when I started to learn just more about the hypersexualization of Asian females. And that also was a real learning moment for me. I had kind of a moment where I was like, okay, this is something that I do actually have to be cautious of. I have to be aware of how my presence is interpreted to white men in general. And that's unfortunately, but Melissa, you've also mentioned about the beauty standard, the physical standards, and I think that is so highly valued in Asian cultures. And, the reason why people in westernized cultures look at us and look at these beauty standards in such a way. I think it led me to become just more aware and to realize that I have to be more, I think, cautious of how I present myself as an Asian female here. I don't want to present in a specific way. I don't want my physical or my appearance to be the primary thing the primary feature that people are looking at. I want people to look at me and see me as I am, as a deaf person. I would rather be perceived as a deaf person as opposed to an Asian person, if that makes sense. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's sometimes what I feel like. I identify deaf first and then Asian second. I'm a deaf Asian woman. I've always preferred that. I think when people see me, I want them to see me as a deaf person as opposed to my race and ethnicity. I think there's a lot of discrimination just based on race and ethnicity. And so that's sometimes why I like to put the deafness first. And as a deaf person, I do have a service animal. I have a service dog. My service dog is a pit bull. And so I have also experienced some just stigma associated with that, just my service dog being a pit bull breed. Uh, and I think I do sometimes, bring my dog around in the community and people are saying, okay, you have a pit bull, this cannot be your service animal. They won't permit me to bring my service animal into these places. So I have to take the time to explain to people, regardless of breed, that my animal is still a protected animal under the ADA, regardless of that. And my dog is an accommodation, regardless of, my dog being a pit bull. And my dog, has been trained to guide me around community and make sure that I am attending to what's going on in the environment around me, because I'm deaf, right? I can't be, sometimes I can't hear what's going on behind me if I'm walking somewhere in public, or if somebody is calling my name across a room or something like that. My dog will be able to alert me to those, auditory sounds. So I think those are just some examples of what I have experienced as an API person.
Thank you for that, Marja. Sarita?
I think there's a lot of overlap there with that theme of belonging, and what community do you belong in or don't belong in, or where you have that feeling of belonging. And so again, I prepared a statement because I can't just come up with stuff to say right now. But as an Indian woman living with epilepsy, I've had to navigate ableism from a lot of different directions. In the mainstream disability spaces, API voices, Indian voices are often invisible. The movement is historically centered on white Western narratives that don't reflect our cultural values, our family dynamics, or the unique challenges immigrant communities face. And so that's very isolating. But in API spaces and in the Indian community, disability is deeply stigmatized. It is invisible. It's something to be quietly managed and not discussed. It is a private matter, even a source of shame. So that silence is also deeply isolating. Navigating both these worlds has been hard, especially when navigating this world is being first generation, where you're made to feel like you don't truly belong in either world, and neither country or neither culture, because you're not Indian enough, but you're not American enough. But that has really also shaped how I show up. For a long time, it kept me from speaking up, from showing up, and from seeking help and support. But I've learned to build community at the intersections, to create spaces where our stories are heard and where we are seen and valued. In my work, I try to bridge these divides, centering lived experiences, cultural nuance, and the collective power to empower, and to really find those communities that value those intersections and those different identities. Because to me, those intersectional identities do create who you are. And, there's a huge community of first generation, of course, Indians, that we all have that same collective experience that we're trying to find this belonging, and I think we find it in each other. But then when you add on all these different intersectional personalities and identities, you have to kind of find those spaces as well. And so it's creating those places of understanding and belonging, and I guess teaching each other about those intersectional identities so that you can create actually new communities almost, where you honor every piece of your identity, because every piece I think is equally important to me.
Thank you, Sarita. Melissa next.
I'll talk about it from a few different angles. Ever since I was young, I've really identified strongly with being Japanese and been really proud of that. My mother and my grandmother are the great loves of my life, and so I really felt like really connected to them. But I remember, comments early on, especially when I was having a lot of reconstructive surgery right after the attack, and if I told people I was Japanese, often what I'd get is, well, I can't really see it because your face is so messed up, but I can kind of see it in your eyes. And that just made me feel like maybe both things were not acceptable as a young girl, because I didn't know what people meant by that. If they were trying to say that this sort of perception of Asian eyes was unattractive, like what they were saying about me was unattractive. All of it was unattractive. That's what it sounded like to me. So I remember feeling really proud of my identity, and then maybe feeling like other people didn't find my identity to be beautiful, or they found more fault in my face for the elements of my face that maybe did look Japanese. And so I just remember these feelings of growing up, of feeling like proud, but maybe no part of me was really acceptable or beautiful to the society, be it my culture, my race, my disability as well. And then in terms of more of the Asian experience with disability, in Japanese culture, you're really raised to be polite. That's a really high value in Japanese culture, to be polite, to show grace and respectability to other people. Oftentimes, even if it's not shown to you, that's sort of a sign of like, dignity and respect, is that even when it's not shown to you, you're polite, you give gifts, you create this sort of culture. So I remember growing up and feeling like what was most paramount was that I be polite, and I be well-mannered, and I accomplish things. And so when things were said to me, and when you have this experience of facial disfigurement, things are said to you about every hour. Or comments or stares or all kinds of things. And I remember in these social situations when people were staring or making comments or inquiring about what happened to me, this sort of overwhelming urge to be polite and to accommodate everyone around me, and how important that was to my family and to my culture as well. And I felt that from my mom and grandma too. We were all part of this. We're all a part of this culture. So when people approached us and asked what happened to me, we were all polite, and we all sort of soothed the person who asked. Even as an adult, I still do that. Sometimes now I don't know if it's survival or cultural or what it is, but the burden I feel like is on me to soothe the world with my appearance and my disability. And the reactions are so extreme and they're so frequent that it's just sort of a constant thing that I have to do. And people can be pretty rude if they ask what happened and you say like, I don't feel comfortable, or, people can get pretty aggressive. They can feel pretty entitled, which I also sometimes wonder, and if there's gender and race dynamics to that, would they feel so brazen to come up to a man and ask really personal questions about his physical appearance? Or if that's something society feels more comfortable asking a woman, particularly a woman of color, to be accountable, to explain herself and her body to the world. So I think all of those elements are true, and they're all really difficult to navigate. You often wish you could change the world, and I think I've come to a place as I've gotten older, is if the world is like this, what are things I can do to protect myself and my mental health and my family and all of those things? And what do I owe people and what do I not? And what do I sometimes have to deal with in order to have a job, or in order to just sort of navigate society reasonably well, and often that means I do have to explain myself a lot. So I've had a lot of anger in the course of my life, and as I've gotten older, I've tried to have a level of surrender and acceptance, not in a sad way, but in a way that is accepting of who I am and the experience I have in the world. And, you know, I think to myself, what I wouldn't give for just one day to walk down the street where no one looked at me and no one stared at me and no one made fun of me. And that's not a life experience I'm ever going to have. So given that that's so, what can I do, and who can I show up as, and what can I do to help others who might have a similar experience, especially other children, because I know how hard this was for me to navigate as a child. Extreme social rejection in childhood is a really true difficult thing to navigate, and it has lasting impacts on someone's adulthood too. And so now that I have a child of my own, I even try to think through how she's managing having me as a mother and what's said about me in her school if I go volunteer and stuff like that. But how do I do so in a way that honors some of the beautiful things about my culture and some of the things, the pressures that my culture puts on me too, particularly around the space of being polite always, and accommodating always.
Thank you. We have our third question. Where do you find strength, joy, and or healing in community as an API person living with a disability? And as usual, we will start with Marja.
Yeah, I find more of my strength in sharing my life experiences with others and other deaf Asian people, especially women. I think because of a lot of deaf Asian women do face more barriers as opposed to um, their male counterparts, just in general because of the gender barriers and the gender discrimination that we experience, and also the physical appearance. You know, as an Asian woman, the challenges that poses. I feel like I find more strength, and also think healing in a way for me, learning more about my culture and also educating others at the same time. I also really feel more of a sense of belonging when I'm going to these deaf events. When when people are looking at me and seeing me as a deaf person showing up in these spaces, asking me about my experience as an Asian person in America. Um, I feel, very happy and open to share my experiences, and I do feel healing in that way, just because sometimes, growing up the way I did, there were those struggles about belonging, not just only being an Asian person within a white community, but also being a deaf person within that community. And that was, as Melissa mentioned, I think the social rejection is very real, and I've experienced that as well. And I think, because being a deaf person and going to a hearing school, I was always picked last for whatever it may be, right, in gym class, or just those kind of quintessential things. If you're dividing up into groups, I was always picked last. Or if there was a sporting event, I was always picked last. Just things of that nature that really resonated with what you were saying, Melissa. And also just the communication aspect, not being able to communicate freely or easily with my peers. And that experience really led me to where I am today and how I educate and choose to educate others, so that others can really learn how they can minimize that experience and not harm to others moving forward. Yeah.
Thank you. Same question to you, Sarita, or Sarita, sorry.
Yeah, and I think that theme of just that growing up with that isolation or being isolated when you're in a predominantly white school, because I think I was like the only person of color in my school too. Like maybe there was one other person. But yeah, and so you experience that absolute isolation of like being chosen last for anything. And so where is that sense of belonging? And so I think now I find strength and healing in the communities I've created for myself, where having a disability and being Indian are not shameful or invisible, where I don't have to justify or explain my identity, where I am accepted and appreciated, safe to be myself fully and authentically, where I can be vulnerable in joy, in grief, in rage, in challenges. There's something really powerful about being in intersectional spaces where you see yourself represented and your identity centered, where you know you are understood without having to justify and explain your identity, and where we can laugh and cry at what's hard, speak our truths, and celebrate the wins, large and small. I find healing in knowing I'm not alone, and the sharing of stories of cultural wisdom in witnessing each other's disabilities and illnesses and cultural expectations, and seeing ourselves reflected in each other, and grieving together at loss, raging together at injustices, and dreaming together at possibilities. Community is where we all thrive. I find joy in building with others in nature and always pushing the limits and boundaries, but also living, being, and doing in community where we are all supported and culture is honored, and finding the moments that are just bring that quiet, simple peace together. And I think, again, it all goes back to that feeling of belonging. In a world that is really trying to separate us, coming together and living with bold, authentic audacity and reclaiming our individual and collective power is just so healing and joyful.
Thank you. Melissa, next.
So one of the advantages of spending your whole childhood in the hospital is you read a lot. So I sort of grew up with this extreme love for books. I read all the time about everything. And as I got older, I read more stories of people who had disabilities. And as I talked about when I was younger, I didn't feel like I had a disability. I didn't know what to call my situation. I didn't know anyone like me. I never encountered anyone who'd had something similar happen to them. And so when I started reading, I feel like many of us are saying it's like you're exposed to people who maybe you're not at school with when you're a child. You know, you're really at school with this small demographic of people. It's hard to imagine that there's other people in the world who could in any way be like you. But I started reading more and more, and I just identified so much with different stories of disability and the different experiences people described. And so it occurred to me then actually like, oh, this is the community that I relate most to as they tell their stories of growing up and different experiences. Though their disabilities might be different than mine, their experience of the world and how the world perceives them is so similar to how I feel. And I read one book recently. It's called Life on Delay, Making Peace with a Stutter by John Hendrickson. And I was listening to it on audio, and he has a whole section in the book where he talks about the look. And it's the look people give him when he starts to speak and they start to hear that he has a stutter. And he describes the look as a mixture of pity, disgust, discomfort, sort of describes all of the stuff that happens before someone even speaks, just in the look that they give you. And I remember reading that and thinking you could stutter for facial disfigurement, and I get that look all the time. And it is exactly as he described. And he says in the book, it'd be one thing, right, if you got the look every now and again, but to get it every time you go to a gas station, every time you go to a grocery store, everywhere you go, people give you this look of horror, disgust, pity, and what that starts to do to you over and over again. And I remember listening to those passages and just feeling like this person is me, like this person, like I felt him within me and within my own story. And it was just this remarkable feeling of joy, honestly, because I thought someone knows exactly what this feels like and they're navigating this too. And in the book, he goes on to even talk about finding a job, finding a romantic partner, and how those things weave into this experience. And I felt all those things too. You know, prom and homecoming, no one would ever ask me. They wouldn't even think to ask me. And I wouldn't even I wouldn't even admit if I ever had a crush on someone, because I would feel like maybe I would humiliate that person socially in high school by even saying that I had a crush on them, because I just felt like I was so disgusting and I didn't want to bother anyone. And so as these sort of normal high school experiences happen, I really tried to distance myself from them, because I felt like I couldn't participate, because beauty is the paramount thing when you're a teenage girl. So he navigates all of this. And so this is all to say that my joy is really in hearing the stories and experiences of others and having these feelings of like, I'm not alone and I've never been alone, and thinking of my small child self and having some empathy for her, to go back and, say you were never alone. There were all these people living these same experiences, just in different ways. And so part of my joy as an adult is working more with children. And there's a good quote. I'm not going to know who it's by, because I just remember the quote, not the author, but the quote is, "Be who you needed as a child." And as a child, I needed to know I wasn't alone. And so some of the work I do now as an adult is to be really visible to particularly children with disabilities, to know that every experience they're having, they're in no way alone. And their life is not written for them in high school or middle school or whatever age that you can go through, where you feel like your experience is pretty isolated if there are not other people like you at your school. So I try to remember, like in adulthood, it's easy for us to forget that in childhood, your world is really just your school. And so I've gotten a lot of joy in going into schools and being able to connect with kids and let them know there's other people like them and there's a whole world waiting for them. That is a world of more acceptance than they're probably experiencing in their childhood.
Sorry, the mute was being a bit difficult. Time for our final question before Q&A. What are your hopes for how API communities can show up more fully for disability justice? We will start with Marja.
For me, my hope is for API communities to welcome in more deaf API people into the conversation, and to learn more about intersectionality for API people experiencing barriers and navigating life. And I want them to become more understanding and have more patience for deaf API people. For example, communication access. We need communication access available to us. And however it looks like. It could be writing notes back and forth, or it could be bringing in an ASL interpreter, or including captioning in a meeting. It could be any of those. So it's really about how API people can be more accepting to the deaf community. My biggest wish for this world is for it to become barrier-free for anybody who has a disability.
Thank you. Sarita?
To me, disability justice is at its core about recognizing and honoring intersectionality, and understanding our experiences as disabled people are deeply shaped by our intersectional identities. My hope is API communities begin to see disability justice not as a separate issue, but as an integral part of our collective fight for equity. To show up more fully, API communities must create spaces where disabled individuals feel seen, heard, valued, and safe. But this also means challenging the idea of API as a singular identity. API is a broad term that encompasses a diverse diaspora. Each country in Asia and the Pacific Islands has its own histories, languages, and cultures. Lumping us together is convenient and easier for Western culture, but it shows a lack of understanding and erases the richness and complexities of our individual communities. Just as disability justice teaches us to honor the uniqueness of each person's lived experience, we must apply that same principle when we speak about the API diaspora. We must recognize and uplift the needs, traditions, and voices within each distinct community, and recognize it is up to each community to come together, not only under API, but in disability justice. Only then can we build meaningful solidarity across communities, a solidarity rooted in both collective action and respect for individual identities. We must come together now more than ever, recognizing our oppression is collective, as is our power, our justice, and our liberation.
Thank you for that. And finally, Melissa.
I mentioned storytelling and what a huge component it's had on the happiness in my life. And so one of my hopes is that our stories make it to the mainstream, make it to bestsellers and make it to movies. And I think, that one of the stats that I've read multiple times is only 4% of storylines right now in mainstream media feature a person with a disability. And often those stories are fiction. So they're not written by a person who actually has a disability, but maybe a person who doesn't, who's imagining what that experience is like, or it's by an actor pretending to have that disability, but they don't actually have that lived experience. So for me, justice looks like our stories start to be the stories that are really shown in multiple spaces and our voices are really heard. I just read 3 books recently, which were all amazing, and they all featured disability, and they all featured disability from a boy's perspective. And so not just in race, but I feel like the stories of women and disability are not as showcased. I often talk about how my own experience, sometimes I'll tell people, I'll mention the book Wonder as an example. And interestingly, the author of the book Wonder was interviewed because she based the book off of her children's experiences with a girl who had facial difference. And so they asked her why she made the character a boy instead of a girl, because it was based on this real experience her children had of making fun of this child. And that was her inspiration for writing Wonder. And she said, I didn't make the main character a girl because a girl with like a facial difference, a facial disfigurement would never survive. And I thought, oh my gosh, our perception of women and girls and what they can survive and their strength is told for us. It's not told by us. And so justice for me is experiences like this that we're having tonight, where people with lived experiences are able to center their own stories and not have their stories imagined, fictionalized, told for them. And I'll just end by saying, since I'm such a literary person, I had this experience when I was younger of reading Amy Tan, and I had never read an Asian writer. I'd never seen an Asian writer be a bestseller, and it was the Joylet Club. And I just remember, of course, it's a different culture and different background, but I related so much to Amy Tan's experience. And I remember going to the Boulder bookstore and getting to see Amy Tan read. And I just remember her walking through the crowd. And I just felt like, oh my gosh, someone like me is at the Boulder bookstore and they're reading their book. And I remember she sort of looked across the crowd and she looked at me and I thought, oh my gosh, I hope she doesn't I hope I haven't offended her with my face. I was like such a fan, I just didn't want her to stare at me or say anything to me. And she looked over at me and she winked at me and gave me a thumbs up. And I just thought, oh gosh, Amy Tan, And so I just remember this feeling of being young and seeing someone in the Asian community have her story out there, have her book be out in the world. And I just remember what it meant to me and how much it made me feel like was possible for me and how grateful I was to her for just being such a person in the world and telling her stories. And so justice to me looks like more younger kids are showing up in spaces and saying, look, there's a person who's like me, and that person makes me feel like I can do anything.
Thank you. And with that, we wrapped up the established questions leading to such an incredible conversation. Thank you all for your wisdom, vulnerability, and power. But we also want to thank everyone for being a part of this important gathering. So we do have one question that I want to ask everyone, maybe minute responses to make sure. Julie asks, what should disability organizations like CCDC be doing to be welcoming and accessible, especially to people who are people of color who may not have a large cultural community, as some of you have mentioned? So would you like to put any input, Marja?
Yeah, that's a really good question. A great question. I'm actually we're working on, we have a lot of federal cuts going on right now for funding. And that impacts an organization like CCDC. And so what I'm really thinking about what a disability organization to do is maybe set up like a group for people who share the same experience, or partner with community events, like a Asian community event. Like on May 16th, in a couple weeks, there's the AAPI community event at the Civic Center. I'm not 100% sure, but I'm pretty sure there's going to be ASL interpreters for the performers. But I would love to have some kind of collaboration with your organization to help make sure there are ASL interpreters and more deaf Asian people do come out to the event. So yeah, that's pretty much my answer.
Okay, Sarita?
I think it's important to go into the spaces. So where whatever community, Asian community, API community, individual Indian communities, whatever it is, to go into those spaces and not expect individuals to come, or the communities to come to the organization in their space, in CCDC space. So wherever there is an event, I think like Mario was saying, like wherever there's an event that is already happening, to partner in with those events, or to host an event at a place that is already where the community already gathers, versus, right, because you want to go, you want to go sit at someone's table and talk to them at their own table. And so that is, and not expect people to come to you, you know, you want to go and sit with people and talk to them and welcome them that way. I think it's important to go into other people's communities in order to bring people together.
Okay, and Melissa?
Gosh, that's a hard question. I think all of us really, probably why Julie asked that question, all of us on the call talked about this feeling of isolation and being the only one. And particularly in an area like Colorado, I don't know, I'm lucky if I ever meet someone who's Japanese or even part Japanese in my day-to-day. But I think, you know, I will say I really relate to the comment about Asian communities all sort of being lumped together and how it can feel like we're all sort of the same, but then we all really are not. And we have these really different countries and different cultural experiences. And at the same time, I also really do feel connected to so many marginalized groups. I find a lot of connection, as I said, to people who have disabilities that are different from my own, but when we start talking, we share so many of the same experiences. So I think just continuing to find people who are willing to speak about their experiences, to continue to connect people together who might be interested in knowing each other or working together, or anything like that. I do feel in Colorado, especially in the Front Range area, that it can feel kind of small. Like if someone's in this sort of Front Range area, it's pretty easy to get together with them and know them. So just continuing to, if you meet someone who might be interested in knowing someone else, make those connections and be on social media and all those types of spaces.
Okay. And with that, let me just go ahead and spotlight. As you have heard today, disability justice is deeply tied to community, culture, and collective action. And that's what we are exactly trying to build through CCDC and the Unstoppable Together campaign. Sorry, a lot of stuff is happening with the display. So with that, we have this graphic provided, and with it, we invite you to stay connected with us. On the left, you will see a QR code to become a member of CCDC. Membership is free, and it's one of the most powerful ways to stand with the disability community. Members receive updates on advocacy efforts, opportunities to take action, and invitations to future panels like this one. On the right, you can register for the next event. We will be hosting more Unstoppable Together community panels and events throughout the year. This QR code allows you to register for our next panel, Pride in Everybody, Queer and Voices of Disability Leading Change, on May 22nd at 6 p.m., so the same time as tonight. Be on the lookout for registration information and our member alerts and our social media accounts. We are unstoppable when we move together, when we honor each other's stories, and when we commit to building a future where everyone rises. Thank you all for being here tonight with us today. Well, you know. But stay steadfast, stay rising, and stay unstoppable together. Thank you, and have a great night.